Oxford's most brilliant mind, a latent criminal waiting to be exposed, and a double agent trapped in the heart of the Cold War. This is the story of Jeremy Wolfenden, blackmailed by Soviet intelligence in Moscow for his homosexuality, then coerced by British intelligence to act as human bait. His life ended in a sudden, deeply mysterious death in Washington at just 31 years old. But the ultimate historical irony is this: how does a genius get crushed by the very same ruthless legal system his own father was actively working to dismantle? Jeremy Wolfenden was born in 1934 into a world that demanded absolute conformity and rewarded it with immense power. The British establishment of the mid-20th century was a rigid, unforgiving architecture of class, reputation, and stoic discretion. At the absolute center of this architecture stood his father, John Wolfenden. Sir John was not merely an educator. He was the archetype of the trusted public servant. He was a man who exuded moral authority, a figure so respected that the government routinely handed him the nation's most delicate social problems to solve. Growing up in the Wolfenden household meant living under the crushing weight of a pristine family name. Excellence was not an aspiration, it was the baseline and expectation. There was an unspoken covenant in such families. The privileges of wealth, education, and access came with the strict obligation to maintain absolute self-control and protect the family's honor at all costs. From his earliest days, Jeremy demonstrated an intellectual capacity that set him apart not just from his peers, but from his instructors. By the time he reached Magdalen College, Oxford, he was not simply a student. He was an academic phenomenon. His mind processed information with terrifying speed. He possessed a photographic memory, a natural command of complex languages, and an analytical sharpness that allowed him to deconstruct political and philosophical arguments effortlessly. Those who shared seminar rooms and dining halls with him did not use the phrase "the smartest man of his generation" as a casual compliment. It was stated as an objective fact. He was the center of gravity in any intellectual circle, holding court with a natural charisma that made it clear he was destined for the highest ranks of the British government, academia, or international journalism. He lacked nothing. He had the pedigree, the wealth, the connections, and the raw brainpower to dictate the terms of his own life. This immense privilege is precisely what made his underlying reality so precarious. The higher a man sits in the establishment, the further he has to fall. Beneath the glittering surface of his Oxford triumphs, Jeremy harbored a reality that the British state considered a profound aberration. He was a homosexual man living in a society that actively hunted and prosecuted sexual relationships between men. In the 1950s, the legal and cultural climate in Britain was brutal. Homosexuality was not merely a social taboo, it was a severe criminal offense punishable by hard labor. The police actively targeted men like Jeremy, utilizing plainclothes officers and informants to secure arrests. The consequences of discovery were absolute and irreversible. A man named in the press for a homosexual offense faced immediate social execution. He would be expelled from his university, fired from his job, disowned by his family, and permanently branded as a pariah. More importantly, for someone in Jeremy's position, the government viewed homosexuality as a critical national security threat. The logic of the era dictated that because homosexual men had a ruinous secret, they were natural targets for blackmail by hostile foreign powers. Therefore, they were systemically purged from the civil service, the military, and any position of influence. Living with this secret was a constant paradox. His staggering intellect, which allowed him to dissect the works of ancient philosophers and modern geopolitical strategies, offered absolutely no defense against the blunt force of the law. He understood the political machinery of Britain better than almost anyone, yet he remained entirely powerless over the fact that a single whispered rumor or a misplaced letter could detonate his entire existence. Unlike many who hid in the shadows, Jeremy was known in elite Oxford circles for his rebellious, heavy-drinking lifestyle, and was surprisingly open about his sexuality among peers. Yet, this brazen confidence offered absolutely no legal protection against the British state. Every interaction, every private moment carried the weight of potential ruin. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. He was a man who could see the world with perfect clarity, yet he was denied the right to exist truthfully within it. The British elite embraced him for his mind, but would have destroyed him without hesitation for his nature. He was navigating a minefield in the dark, fully aware that his proximity to power only amplified the explosive yield of his secret. A scandal would not just end his promising career, it would humiliate Sir John Wolfenden, provide fodder for the relentless British tabloid press, and permanently sever his ties to the only world he had ever known. The trap was already set, built by the very society that praised his genius, long before he ever set foot on foreign soil or encountered a foreign intelligence agent. The trap that would eventually consume Jeremy Wolfenden was being actively examined in the very halls of power his family occupied, creating a historical paradox so sharp it borders on the unbelievable. In the summer of 1954, the British political establishment reached a breaking point regarding its moral policing. The nation was gripped by a moral panic, heavily influenced by the Cold War paranoia bleeding across the Atlantic. In the public and political consciousness, homosexuality had become inextricably linked with treason. The high-profile defections of Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, diplomats who were both Soviet spies and known within elite circles to have homosexual relationships, had convinced the security services that gay men were inherently compromised, vulnerable to blackmail, and sympathetic to subversion. The state's response was a vicious, highly publicized crackdown. Police forces employed agent provocateurs to entrap men in public parks and restrooms. Prominent figures, including Lord Montague of Beaulieu and the brilliant mathematician Alan Turing, were subjected to humiliating trials, imprisonment, or forced chemical castration. The message from the state was unambiguous. No amount of aristocratic blood or intellectual genius could shield you from destruction. It was in this climate of state-sanctioned terror that the conservative government appointed a departmental committee on homosexual offenses and prostitution. They needed a figurehead to navigate this politically explosive minefield, a man of unassailable character, bureaucratic competence, and absolute moral authority. They selected Sir John Wolfenden. For 3 grueling years, Sir John presided over closed-door sessions, listening to the clinical, often deeply prejudiced testimonies of psychiatrists, police chief constables, religious leaders, and legal scholars. He sat at the head of the table, tasked with dissecting the legal framework that governed the very existence of men, exactly like his son. The psychological weight of this period on Jeremy is difficult to overstate. While he was cementing his reputation as Oxford's most dazzling intellect, his father was clinically evaluating whether the state should continue to hunt and imprison people of his nature. There is no historical record indicating that Sir John took the chairmanship to protect Jeremy, nor is there evidence of dramatic family confrontations behind closed doors. The reality was likely much colder and far more agonizing, a profound, suffocating silence. Jeremy had to watch from the sidelines, carrying a secret that, if exposed, would instantly delegitimize his father's committee and destroy his family's standing in the British establishment. He was a spectator to a debate about his own right to exist, entirely aware that a single misstep in his private life would turn him into the ultimate cautionary tale. When the committee finally published its findings in September 1957, it sent a seismic shockwave through British society. The Wolfenden Report, as it became universally known, was a revolutionary document. Its central conclusion dismantled the prevailing logic of the era, asserting that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be a criminal offense. The report established a critical, modern legal boundary. There must remain a realm of private morality and behavior, which is, in brief and decisive terms, not the law's business. It argued forcefully that the state had no place policing the private bedrooms of consenting adults, fundamentally decoupling the concept of sin from the definition of a crime. For a brief moment, it appeared that the oppressive machinery of the British legal system might be dismantled. John Wolfenden had shifted the intellectual paradigm of a nation, but intellectual victories do not automatically rewrite the penal code. The British government, terrified of a conservative public backlash and a hostile tabloid press, effectively shelved the report. Politicians praised its thoroughness in public, while ensuring its recommendations gathered dust in the parliamentary archives. The legal reality remained entirely unchanged. This bureaucratic paralysis created a fatal, unresolved paradox that would dictate the rest of Jeremy's life. His father had successfully argued for his liberation on paper, but in practice, Jeremy remained a criminal in the eyes of the state. He continued to live in a country where his identity was a prosecutable offense, forcing him to maintain the exhausting architecture of a double life. The laws remained on the books, fully armed and ready to be weaponized by anyone who discovered the truth. Unable to live authentically at home, and possessing an intellect that craved global complexities, Jeremy looked outward. Leaving the insular world of Oxford, he transitioned into the high-stakes arena of international journalism, securing a coveted position with the Daily Telegraph. The role of a foreign correspondent in the mid-20th century was tailor-made for a man of his specific talent. He was a linguistic savant, fluent in Russian and capable of mastering new dialects with frightening speed. He possessed a natural, aristocratic charm that allowed him to seamlessly infiltrate diplomatic cocktail parties, government briefings, and exclusive social clubs. He was intellectually agile, capable of digesting dense political shifts and translating them into sharp, analytical prose for the British public. However, during the deep freeze of the Cold War, the boundary separating international journalism from covert intelligence gathering was virtually non-existent. The recruiting grounds for MI6 were not public job boards. They were the oak-paneled rooms of Oxford and Cambridge. Duns and tutors acted as unofficial talent spotters, identifying brilliant, well-connected young men who could serve the crown abroad. A foreign correspondent offered the perfect, legitimate cover for intelligence work. A journalist could travel to restricted regions that official diplomats were barred from entering. They could cultivate relationships with local dissidents, minor bureaucrats, and ordinary citizens under the guise of conducting interviews. They possessed a plausible reason to ask dangerous questions and observe the shifting tides of a foreign society. It is widely accepted within historical circles that Jeremy Wolfenden was brought into the periphery of British intelligence during this period. He was not trained as a cinematic assassin or a covert saboteur. His utility to MI6 lay strictly in his brain and his access. He was an asset, an informant capable of penetrating opaque environments, maintaining discreet contacts, and providing the nuanced geopolitical analysis that official diplomatic channels often failed to capture. He was highly valued by the British government for his mind, yet simultaneously viewed by that very same government as a latent security risk due to his sexuality. The British establishment was perfectly willing to exploit his brilliance for national security while entirely ignoring the immense personal jeopardy his secret placed him in. MI6 sent him out into the Cold War chessboard, fully aware that he carried a vulnerability that a hostile intelligence agency could easily exploit. They armed him with a press credential and a mandate to gather information, but offered absolutely no safety net for the reality of who he was. In the early 1960s, this fragile arrangement was put to the ultimate test when Jeremy was dispatched to the one city on Earth where secrets were the most valuable currency in existence, and where privacy was a physical impossibility: Moscow. Moscow in the early 1960s was not merely a foreign capital. It was an active theater of psychological warfare. For a Western journalist, arriving in the Soviet Union meant crossing a threshold into a meticulously constructed panopticon. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence, operated a surveillance apparatus of unprecedented scale and clinical efficiency. There was no concept of a private sphere. Every foreigner was considered an active hostile agent until proven otherwise, and the state possessed the manpower and the technology to monitor every second of their existence. When Jeremy Wolfenden arrived as the correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, he stepped directly into this suffocating environment. The physical reality of the city was dictated by paranoia. Expatriates lived in designated apartment blocks, entirely isolated from the general Soviet population. These buildings were structurally compromised from the foundation up. Microphones were embedded in the plaster of the walls and the wood of the doorframes. The telephone lines were perpetually monitored by human listeners in windowless rooms blocks away. The local staff, the maids, the drivers, the translators, were either direct employees of the KGB or ordinary citizens coerced into providing weekly intelligence reports on their foreign employers. If Western journalists took a walk, a surveillance team followed in staggered shifts to avoid detection. If they posted a letter, it was intercepted, unsealed with steam, photographed, and resealed. Jeremy was acutely aware of this machinery. MI6 had certainly briefed him on the standard operating procedures of Soviet counterintelligence. He knew that the primary objective of the KGB was not necessarily to prevent Westerners from gathering information, but to gather compromising information on the Westerners themselves. The Soviets were masters of compromat, compromising material. They built vast, meticulously detailed psychological profiles of every diplomat, journalist, and businessman who crossed their borders. They looked for financial debts, ideological sympathies, marital infidelities, and above all, hidden vulnerabilities. Jeremy presented a uniquely high-value target. His profile was a contradiction that the KGB was uniquely equipped to exploit. Outwardly, he was a formidable adversary. His absolute fluency in Russian allowed him to bypass official interpreters, listen to untranslated radio broadcasts, and read local publications with a native's comprehension. He was socially magnetic, quickly establishing himself at the center of the isolated, heavily drinking expatriate community in Moscow. He cultivated contacts within the British Embassy, sharing information and analysis with diplomats and intelligence officers operating under official cover. To the casual observer, he was a highly effective, deeply connected British operative thriving in hostile territory. But the KGB did not look at outward success. They looked for structural weaknesses. It did not take long for Soviet intelligence to identify the fault line in Jeremy's life. The exact methodology of how they discovered his homosexuality remains buried in classified archives. But in the environment of 1960s Moscow, discovering such a secret was a matter of routine surveillance. It could have been a monitored phone call, an intercepted letter, or an observation by a designated watcher. Once the KGB confirmed his sexual orientation, Jeremy ceased to be merely a journalist to be monitored. He became an asset waiting to be acquired. The KGB understood the intricacies of British law and class politics far better than the British public did. They knew precisely who John Wolfenden was. They had read the Wolfenden report. They understood the absolute fatal paradox of Jeremy's existence. His father was the public face of moral reform in Britain, yet British law still demanded the imprisonment of homosexual men. The Soviet intelligence apparatus realized they did not need to fabricate a crime. They merely needed to document a reality that the British state had preemptively declared illegal. The operation the KGB launched against Jeremy was textbook, executed with cold, bureaucratic precision. It was a classic honey trap, but tailored specifically for a target who had no legal recourse in his home country. They deployed a young Russian man to intercept Jeremy. Historical accounts and later intelligence debriefings frequently identify this man as a local barber or hairdresser. The initial contact was engineered to appear accidental, a rare moment of genuine human connection in a city defined by suspicion. The relationship that developed was carefully managed by Soviet intelligence. The KGB allowed the intimacy to progress, pulling their overt surveillance back just enough to create a false sense of security. They provided the illusion of a blind spot. Jeremy, existing under the crushing, perpetual isolation of his double life, stepped into the trap. The KGB waited until the optimal moment and then secured their evidence. The exact nature of the proof, whether it was high-resolution photographs taken from a concealed vantage point, audio recordings, or a staged raid on a private room, was secondary to its existence. The evidence was irrefutable. The confrontation, when it arrived, stripped away all pretense. Jeremy was brought face-to-face with KGB officers, not for an ideological debate, but for a transaction. They placed the evidence of his relationship on the table. The ultimatum was devoid of emotion. They required Jeremy Wolfenden to serve as an intelligence asset for the Soviet Union. He was to provide information on British embassy personnel, report on the activities of his journalistic colleagues, and utilize his access to gather intelligence for Moscow. If he refused, the consequences were explicitly outlined. The KGB would not kill him or imprison him in the Soviet Union. They would simply hand the evidence over to the British. The photographs and reports would be simultaneously delivered to the British ambassador in Moscow, the editors of the Daily Telegraph in London, and directly to the desk of Sir John Wolfenden. The psychological violence of this moment is the crux of Jeremy's tragedy. The KGB did not need to threaten him with a Soviet gulag because the British penal system served their purposes perfectly. If the KGB executed their threat, the British establishment would do the KGB's work for them. MI6 would immediately cut all ties, denying he had ever been an asset. The Telegraph would fire him on moral grounds. He would be forced to return to London, where he would face imminent arrest, a highly publicized trial, and a prison sentence of hard labor. His father's reputation, built entirely on the meticulous, objective study of public morality, would be dragged through the tabloid mud, the family name permanently disgraced. In that room in Moscow, Jeremy was forced to look directly at the weapon that was being used to destroy him. It was not a Soviet invention. The KGB was merely holding the gun. The British legal system had manufactured the bullets. The very society that had praised his intellect, educated him at Oxford, and sent him out to defend its interests had explicitly armed its enemies with the power to annihilate him. The laws his father had proven were unjust. The laws the British Parliament had cowardly refused to repeal were now locked around his throat. He had no embassy to run to for protection. A British citizen compromised by a foreign power can usually seek sanctuary from his own government. But a British citizen compromised by his own illegal nature has nowhere to go. Jeremy was cornered. He could destroy himself and his family immediately, or he could accept the KGB's terms and attempt to survive. He chose to survive, but in doing so, he stepped off the precipice into a terrifying new reality. He walked out of the confrontation no longer just a journalist, and no longer just an MI6 informant. He was now heavily compromised, legally bound to the British state, and secretly owned by the Soviet Union. The pressure of his double life was about to multiply exponentially. Jeremy did not simply fold under the KGB's ultimatum. He possessed a mind trained to analyze complex geopolitical strategies, and he applied that exact cold calculus to his own impending ruin. Upon leaving the KGB safe house, he made a decision that defied the standard psychology of a blackmail victim. He did not pack his bags and flee in the dead of night, nor did he quietly begin handing over state secrets to his Russian handlers. Instead, he walked through the heavy wooden doors of the British embassy in Moscow, requested a meeting in the secure, bug-swept bubble room, and confessed everything to his MI6 contact. This act required an almost incomprehensible level of nerve. By admitting that the KGB had photographic evidence of his homosexual affair, Jeremy was confessing to a severe criminal offense under British law directly to a representative of the British government. He was handing MI6 the very weapon the KGB planned to use against him. He gambled on the premise that his utility as an intelligence asset outweighed the state's mandate to prosecute him as a moral degenerate. His gamble was met with the chilling pragmatism that defines the intelligence world. The officers of MI6 did not view Jeremy as a victim requiring extraction. They did not see a brilliant young man being crushed by an unjust legal system. They saw a tactical opening. The British intelligence apparatus had spent years trying to penetrate the KGB's operational methods in Moscow. Now, they had an operative sitting inside the KGB's own blackmail machinery. Instead of putting Jeremy on the next flight back to London to face the consequences, MI6 issued a directive that would seal his fate. They instructed him to return to the KGB and accept their offer. Jeremy Wolfenden was now a double agent. He was instructed to play the role of the terrified, compliant traitor. The operation was mechanically simple, but psychologically devastating. MI6 would provide Jeremy with chicken feed, a steady stream of low-level, technically accurate, but strategically useless information. Jeremy would pass this information to his KGB handlers, building his credibility as a reliable Soviet asset. In exchange, the British would monitor what the KGB asked Jeremy to acquire. The specific requests made by Soviet intelligence would reveal their blind spots, their priorities, and the identities of their handlers. Jeremy was transformed into a human wiretap, a conduit through which two hostile empires could quietly observe each other. But the operational success of this strategy rested entirely on Jeremy's ability to withstand an unendurable psychological pressure cooker. He was no longer just hiding his sexuality. He was managing a four-dimensional chess match where a single drop piece meant total destruction. He had to convince the KGB that he was betraying his country out of sheer terror of exposure. Simultaneously, he had to convince MI6 that his loyalty to Britain was absolute, despite the fact that the British state actively criminalized his existence and was currently using him as expendable bait. He was required to maintain distinct, compartmentalized realities. When he sat in a Moscow bar with his journalistic colleagues, he was the witty, aristocratic British correspondent. When he met his KGB handlers in sterile apartments, he had to project the nervous submission of a compromised man. When he debriefed with MI6, he had to be the sharp, analytical operative, accurately recalling every word the Soviets had spoken. He had to remember the lies he told the Russians, the partial truths he told the British, and the absolute reality of his own utter isolation. A lesser mind might have cracked immediately, but Jeremy's exceptional intellect was his greatest curse. He possessed the cognitive capacity to hold all these conflicting realities in his head simultaneously, which meant he was acutely, constantly aware of exactly how close he was to the edge. He knew the KGB could release the photographs out of sheer caprice or to test his loyalty. He knew MI6 viewed him as a highly disposable asset. If the KGB discovered he was a double agent, the British government would instantly disavow him, denying any knowledge of his intelligence work and leaving him entirely at the mercy of Soviet interrogators. He had no safe harbor. He could not write to his family about the terror he was enduring. A letter to his father, the esteemed Sir John Wolfenden, would be intercepted by the KGB and read as proof of his duplicity, or intercepted by MI6 and read as a breach of operational security. He was surrounded by diplomats, spies, and journalists, yet he was the most isolated man in Moscow. The law had physically and legally segregated him from any form of protection. To survive the relentless friction of this existence, Jeremy turned to the only anesthetic available in the expatriate circles of the Soviet Union. His alcohol consumption, already notable by the heavy drinking standards of Fleet Street journalists, escalated into a clinical dependency. The alcohol was not a moral failing or a sign of weakness. It was a desperately needed volume dial for an overactive brain. He needed to blunt the edges of his own intellect, to quiet the relentless, calculating voice in his head that constantly simulated the dozen different ways he could be destroyed before breakfast. Outwardly, the facade held. He continued to file sharp, insightful copy for the Daily Telegraph. He continued to host boisterous dinners. He continued to play the role assigned to him by MI6 and the role assigned to him by the KGB. But internally, the foundation was rapidly turning to dust. The human nervous system is not designed to sustain a state of perpetual, high-stakes deception. The cortisol, the paranoia, the lack of sleep, and the heavy influx of alcohol began to rapidly erode the brightest mind of his generation. He was a man controlling the flow of secrets between the two most powerful intelligence agencies on the planet, yet he had absolutely zero control over his own destiny. The British were using the KGB's blackmail to keep him working, and the KGB were using British law to keep him compliant. He was caught in a perfect, lethal equilibrium. How long can a man act as the fulcrum between two crushing weights before his spine simply snaps? The human body is an exquisite machine, but it possesses a finite capacity for enduring sustained, high-frequency stress. In Moscow, Jeremy Wolfenden had pushed far beyond the red line. The daily reality of operating as a double agent, of serving as the silent, unacknowledged battlefield between the KGB and MI6, had begun to fundamentally degrade his physical and psychological architecture. He was not a trained operative hardened by years of psychological conditioning at Fort Monkton. He was a brilliant, highly sensitive academic and journalist thrust into a meat grinder. The alcohol, initially a temporary shield against the crushing paranoia, had calcified into a permanent requirement. His hands developed a faint tremor. His legendary aristocratic composure began to show microscopic, jagged cracks. He was burning out, consuming his own reserves just to maintain the facade of normalcy. The intelligence agencies monitoring him, both British and Soviet, were unsentimental in their evaluations. A compromised asset is only useful as long as they can function under the weight of the compromise. If Jeremy collapsed completely, or worse, if his mind fractured and he publicly exposed the entire operation, the fallout would be catastrophic for MI6 and a lost opportunity for the KGB. A decision was made to alter the board. In 1962, the Daily Telegraph, likely influenced by quiet conversations in Whitehall, reassigned their star correspondent. Jeremy was ordered to pack his bags. His tenure in the Soviet Union was over. He was being transferred to Washington, D.C. The departure from Moscow was not a midnight extraction in the trunk of a diplomatic vehicle. It was a bureaucratic exit conducted under the unblinking gaze of the KGB's second chief directorate. As he boarded the aircraft leaving Soviet airspace, the immediate crushing weight of physical surveillance evaporated. There were no longer microphones embedded in his bedroom walls, nor pedestrian tails tracking his movements through Gorky Park. The sheer relief of that physical liberation must have been intoxicating. He was returning to the West, crossing the Iron Curtain into a society defined by constitutional freedoms and democratic transparency. But this geographical escape was a devastating illusion. A man whose deepest secrets have been weaponized by a hostile state does not escape simply by changing his time zone. The KGB did not destroy the photographs of Jeremy and the Russian barber just because Jeremy surrendered his Moscow apartment. The files, the operational logs, the negative strips, they were simply archived in the vaults of the Lubyanka. They were reclassified from active intelligence to dormant compromat. Jeremy understood the terrifying permanence of intelligence records. He knew with absolute certainty that the KGB Residentura in Washington possessed his file. He had transitioned from an active double agent into a sleeper asset. At any moment, a stranger could approach him at a Washington cocktail party, utter a specific phrase, and the entire nightmare would instantly reactivate. The trap had not been dismantled. The tripwire had merely been lengthened to stretch across the Atlantic Ocean. He carried the Soviet blackmail in his mind, an invisible, malignant tumor that no border checkpoint could detect. Washington in the early 1960s was the undisputed epicenter of global power. It was the era of the Kennedy administration and the escalating tensions of the Cold War, transitioning rapidly into the heavy, consequential years of Lyndon B. Johnson. For a foreign correspondent, it was the most prestigious posting in the world. Jeremy was perfectly positioned to analyze the shifting tides of American politics, the explosion of the civil rights movement, and the quiet, disastrous escalation in Vietnam. His intellect was as sharp as ever. His bylines remained essential reading for the British political class. He moved through Georgetown dinner parties and White House press briefings with the same effortless, aristocratic charm he had wielded in Oxford. Yet, the Washington establishment was governed by its own brutal moral architecture, one that was, in many ways, just as hostile to Jeremy's existence as Moscow had been. The United States government was still recovering from the devastating paranoia of the Lavender Scare, a period in the 1950s where thousands of gay men and women were systematically hunted, interrogated, and purged from federal employment and the military. The logic in Washington mirrored the logic in London. Homosexuality was a grave security risk, a fatal character flaw that left an individual permanently vulnerable to Soviet manipulation. Jeremy was living out the exact nightmare scenario that the American security apparatus feared most. He was a gay man with high-level access to the diplomatic corps who had already been successfully compromised by the KGB. If the CIA or the FBI discovered the truth of his Moscow years, his destruction would be absolute and instantaneous. He would be branded a national security threat, deported, and handed directly over to the British police. The relationship between Jeremy and MI6 during his Washington years remains a subject of intense historical ambiguity. Did British intelligence continue to use him as a conduit, passing sanitized information to the local KGB, or did they consider him burned, cutting him loose and leaving him to navigate the fallout of his compromise entirely alone? The latter scenario is the more chilling and the more likely. Intelligence agencies are notoriously risk-averse regarding damaged assets. Once Jeremy left the specific operational environment of Moscow, his utility to MI6 dropped precipitously, while his liability remained stratospheric. If MI6 abandoned him, they left him stranded in the middle of the Cold War, secretly owned by the Russians, legally hunted by the British, and potentially targeted by the Americans, with absolutely no institutional protection. In 1962, right in the eye of the Moscow intelligence storm, Jeremy made a sudden decision that baffled his contemporaries. He married Martina Warnock, a nanny working at the British Embassy. For a man known within elite circles for his rebellious lifestyle, this sudden marriage appeared to many as a frantic defensive maneuver, a hastily constructed facade deployed right as the KGB tightened its grip. While he may have genuinely sought an anchor in a reality rapidly slipping out of his control, the foundation of the relationship was inherently compromised. He was attempting to build a conventional life while standing on top of an active landmine, a psychological dissonance that accelerated his dangerous reliance on alcohol. The drinking accelerated. The brilliant correspondent who could dissect American foreign policy with a few sharp sentences was slowly disintegrating off the page. The alcohol was no longer just a coping mechanism. It became the primary operating system of his private hours. His friends and colleagues noted the physical decline, the graying of his skin, the exhaustion that seemed to seep from his bones. They attributed it to the demanding pace of the Washington press corps, unaware that they were watching a man being crushed to death by the combined weight of two empires. He was a casualty of war in every sense, but he was denied the dignity of a battlefield. He was fighting a war entirely inside his own mind. He had to wake up every single day and perfectly execute a high-wire act of deception, knowing that the safety net had been removed years ago, and knowing that the very people who were supposed to protect him, his government, his intelligence service, were the ones who had originally outlawed his right to exist. The trap his father had tried to dismantle in 1957 was still completely intact. Sir John Wolfenden was continuing his distinguished public career in Britain, universally respected as a pillar of moral reason. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, his son was physically and mentally collapsing under the enforcement of the very laws Sir John had condemned. The intellectual victory of the Wolfenden report offered absolutely zero practical protection for Jeremy. The law is not a philosophical concept when it is applied to your life. It is a physical force, and that force was slowly, systematically tearing Jeremy Wolfenden apart. The final act of his life would not take place in an interrogation room or on a frozen bridge in Berlin. The climax of this sprawling geopolitical tragedy would be confined to the smallest, most private space imaginable, leaving behind a silence that history has never been able to fully decipher. The year 1965 marked the final precipitous descent. Jeremy Wolfenden was only 31 years old, an age when most men of his intellectual pedigree were just beginning to consolidate their power and influence within the British establishment. By all outward metrics, he was still the golden boy of Fleet Street, a respected foreign correspondent in the most important political capital in the free world. But the internal reality was a state of advanced collapse. The human mind is not built to permanently sustain the agonizing friction of a quadruple life. He was a husband masking his homosexuality, a journalist masking his intelligence work, an MI6 asset masking his KGB compromise, and a Soviet pawn desperately trying to project loyalty to Britain. The architecture of these lies required massive amounts of cognitive energy to maintain, and Jeremy simply had nothing left to burn. His physical deterioration became impossible to ignore. The sharp, vibrant Oxford prodigy had been replaced by a man who looked chronically exhausted, his nervous system constantly frayed. The heavy drinking, once a social lubricant and a temporary escape from his suffocating reality, had evolved into a desperate daily necessity to manage the sheer terror of his existence. Washington, D.C. was a city crawling with intelligence operatives, counterintelligence sweeps, and political paranoia. Every phone call, every unexpected knock at the door, every invitation to a diplomatic reception carried the potential for the KGB to activate their sleeper asset, or for the CIA to uncover his compromised past in Moscow. He lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a guillotine that simply refused to drop. Then, the waiting abruptly ended. The climax of Jeremy Wolfenden's extraordinary, tragic trajectory did not occur on a fog-draped bridge during a prisoner exchange, nor did it happen in the basement of a Soviet interrogation center. It occurred in the mundane, strictly private confines of a bathroom in Washington, D.C. He was found dead. The sudden, unceremonious end of a 31-year-old man who was outwardly healthy sent a shockwave through his immediate circle. When a figure of Jeremy's prominence, the son of Sir John Wolfenden, a star journalist, and a man quietly known to be connected to the shadow world of espionage, dies under sudden and private circumstances, the machinery of the state and the press immediately mobilizes. But the official explanation offered to the public and the grieving family was jarring in its clinical brevity. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as a cerebral hemorrhage. A blood vessel inside the brain of the smartest man of his generation had catastrophically ruptured, flooding the cranial cavity and terminating his life almost instantly. From a clinical standpoint, his death was less a poetic tragedy and more the brutal consequence of physiological collapse. Years of extreme alcohol abuse, a desperate coping mechanism for his double life, had severely damaged his liver, critically affecting his blood's ability to clot. It is highly probable that a simple fall in a Washington bathroom, combined with his severely weakened physical state, triggered the fatal cerebral hemorrhage. His brilliant mind did not buckle under abstract pressure. His body simply surrendered to the harsh medical realities of severe addiction. The official ruling of a natural, albeit premature, death provided the British establishment and his family with a neat, respectable conclusion. It allowed Sir John Wolfenden to bury his son without the humiliating glare of a public scandal. It allowed the Daily Telegraph to publish glowing obituaries praising his journalistic brilliance and lamenting the tragic loss of a young talent. It allowed the British government to quietly close the file on a highly problematic individual without having to address the uncomfortable reality of his intelligence work or the legal persecution that had facilitated his compromise. However, in the deeply cynical world of Cold War intelligence, a natural death of a compromised operative is never accepted at face value. The sudden demise of Jeremy Wolfenden immediately birthed a series of dark, lingering suspicions that historians and intelligence analysts continue to debate decades later. The first and most persistent theory is assassination. The KGB was notoriously ruthless in its handling of assets who had outlived their usefulness or who posed a risk of exposing Soviet operational methods. Did the KGB Residentura in Washington determine that Jeremy was on the verge of a complete psychological breakdown? Did they fear that his escalating alcoholism would loosen his tongue, leading him to confess his entanglement to the American authorities? In the intelligence theater of the 1960s, a stealth assassination utilizing untraceable chemical agents designed to mimic a heart attack or a brain hemorrhage was a documented tactic. Eliminating Jeremy would permanently tie up a loose end, ensuring that the secrets of the Moscow honey trap died with him. The second theory, equally tragic, suggests suicide. The psychological burden Jeremy carried was unendurable. He knew that the laws of his home country still criminalized his fundamental nature. He knew the KGB possessed the absolute power to destroy his family's legacy with a single envelope of photographs. He knew MI6 viewed him as a contaminated liability. Did the brightest mind of his generation calculate that there was no mathematical solution to his existence that did not end in total ruin? It is highly plausible that a man trapped in such a hopeless, claustrophobic reality might choose to engineer his own exit. If Jeremy did take his own life, the authorities, out of deference to Sir John Wolfenden and the desire to avoid a messy public inquiry, might have quietly sanitized the official report, labeling it a cerebral hemorrhage to spare the family the ultimate stigma of the era. History demands strict adherence to documented facts, and the fact remains that there is no declassified evidence proving either murder or suicide. The medical ruling stands as the official truth, but the context of his life renders that official truth profoundly unsatisfying. The ambiguity surrounding his death is the final, cruel consequence of the double life he was forced to lead. When a man is forced to lie about his sexuality, his employment, and his allegiances, even his death becomes a cipher, stripped of certainty and open to endless paranoid interpretation. The reaction of the British intelligence apparatus to Jeremy's death was defined by total, chilling silence. There were no covert commendations. There were no unnamed stars carved into a marble wall honoring his sacrifice. MI6 did not recognize him as an agent who had walked into the jaws of the KGB and attempted to feed them disinformation for the crown. They viewed him precisely as they always had, a liability to be managed, and ultimately a problem that had conveniently solved itself. His files were locked away in the darkest archives of Whitehall, thoroughly sanitized of any reference to his intelligence work or his Soviet compromise. The British state, which had aggressively recruited him for his genius and then callously abandoned him because of his sexuality, simply erased him from the historical narrative of the Cold War. Jeremy Wolfenden was reduced to a footnote, a brilliant young journalist who drank too much and died too young. The true magnitude of his struggle, the unbearable weight of the secrets he carried to the grave, was buried with him. He died far from home in a foreign capital, crushed between two geopolitical superpowers because his own government had legally declared his fundamental nature a crime. He had played the deadliest game of the 20th century, armed with nothing but his intellect, and he had paid the absolute maximum price. But the ultimate historical irony of his brief, agonizing life had not yet come to pass. The aftermath of Jeremy Wolfendon's death in 1965 was defined by the one thing the British establishment excelled at above all else: absolute, impenetrable silence. The machinery of state preservation immediately activated to bury not just the man, but the radioactive secrets he carried. There were no public inquiries, no deep journalistic investigations into the circumstances of his cerebral hemorrhage, and no questions asked in the House of Commons regarding the sudden demise of a prominent intelligence asset. MI6 sanitized their internal archives, effectively erasing his tenure as a double agent. The Foreign Office filed away his diplomatic reports, divorcing his brilliant geopolitical analysis from the tragic reality of his existence. He was swiftly categorized as a closed file, a potential liability that had resolved itself before the damage could spill into the public domain. For Sir John Wolfenden, the private grief must have been an agonizing, isolating burden. He was a man of the Victorian mold, conditioned to project unwavering stoicism regardless of internal devastation. He buried his son with the quiet dignity demanded of his social class, offering no public comment on the swirling rumors of espionage and blackmail. Yet, possessing the analytical mind that had made him a trusted servant of the crown, Sir John could not have been blind to the underlying truth. He knew the immense, crushing pressure his son lived under. He knew the legal reality of being a homosexual man in a society that actively hunted them. He had spent 3 years of his life meticulously studying that exact reality, listening to the testimonies of men whose lives had been destroyed by the very laws his son was forced to evade. Whether Sir John knew the specific details of the KGB honey trap in Moscow or the subsequent MI6 coercion is a secret he took to his grave, but he undoubtedly understood that his casualty of the system he had attempted to reform. While Jeremy lay in his grave, the political tectonic plates in London were finally beginning to shift. The mid-1960s brought a wave of cultural revolution that the old, rigid British Guard could no longer entirely suppress. The moral panic of the 1950s was slowly giving way to a more pragmatic, modern understanding of civil liberties. In Westminster, the Wolfenden Report, which had been cowardly shelved by the government a decade earlier out of fear of public backlash, was pulled from the archives. The intellectual groundwork laid by Sir John Wolfenden in 1957 had quietly marinated in the political consciousness, and a coalition of progressive lawmakers decided the time had come to dismantle the Victorian Penal Code. The parliamentary debates that followed were a stark, infuriating contrast to the brutal reality Jeremy had experienced. In the ornate, comfortable chambers of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, politicians engaged in abstract philosophical arguments about morality, sin, and the social fabric of the nation. They debated the theoretical consequences of decriminalization, entirely insulated from the lethal physical enforcement of the laws they were discussing. They spoke of blackmail and national security as hypothetical concepts, willfully ignorant of the fact that those very concepts had recently been weaponized by the Soviet Union to crush one of their own citizens. The slow, deliberate machinery of democratic reform ground forward, oblivious to the bodies left in its wake. In July 1967, the British Parliament finally passed the Sexual Offences Act. It received royal assent and immediately altered the legal landscape of the nation. The core recommendation of the Wolfenden Report became the law of the land. Homosexual acts in private between two consenting adults over the age of 21 were no longer a criminal offense. With the stroke of a pen, the British state officially withdrew from the private bedrooms of its citizens. The threat of police entrapment, the fear of public prosecution, and the absolute social ruin that had defined the existence of gay men in Britain for centuries were legally dismantled. The passage of this law solidified Sir John Wolfendon's legacy as one of the great moral reformers of the 20th century. He had successfully shifted the paradigm of a nation, proving that the state has no business legislating private morality. He was celebrated as a hero of civil liberties, a man whose objective reasoning had conquered prejudice. But for Jeremy Wolfenden, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act is the ultimate devastating historical irony. Exactly 24 months separated Jeremy's agonizing, lonely death in a Washington bathroom from the legal liberation his father had designed for him. 2 years. In the grand span of history, 24 months is a microscopic fraction of time. But for a man being crushed by the weight of 2 hostile intelligence agencies, it is an eternity. Jeremy died in the waiting room of his own freedom. He was tortured, blackmailed, and ultimately driven to an early grave over a private act that his own country was on the verge of declaring entirely legal. The tragedy of this timeline exposes a brutal truth about legislative reform. The delay of justice is a form of active violence. The 10-year gap between the publication of the Wolfenden Report in 1957 and the passage of the Sexual Offences Act in 1967 was not a harmless period of political deliberation. It was a decade of active, state-sponsored terror. It was a decade where the KGB was allowed to continue using British law as a weapon against British citizens. The politicians who shelved the report in 1957 out of political cowardice were directly responsible for maintaining the exact conditions that allowed Soviet intelligence to trap Jeremy in Moscow. The moment the 1967 Act became law, the KGB's greatest weapon against the British establishment was instantly neutralized. Without the threat of domestic prosecution, Soviet blackmail based on homosexuality lost its explosive yield. If a British diplomat or intelligence officer were photographed in a compromising position by the KGB after 1967, they could simply report the incident to their superiors without the automatic guarantee of prison and social execution. The state's decision to stop persecuting its own citizens resulted in a massive, immediate enhancement of national security. The British government finally realized what Jeremy had known all along. State oppression does not protect a nation. It simply creates vulnerabilities for enemies to exploit. But that realization came too late for the smartest man of his generation. Jeremy Wolfenden was a casualty of a bureaucratic lag. He was forced to fight a shadow war with zero protection, utilizing his formidable intellect to stave off destruction just long enough to maintain the honor of a family and a country that offered him nothing in return. He bore the total weight of a systemic failure, paying the maximum price for a crime that was about to be erased from the history books. In 1967, just 24 months after Jeremy bled to death on a bathroom floor, the British Parliament passed the Sexual Offences Act. The very laws his father had fought to dismantle were finally erased. Homosexuality was decriminalized, and the KGB's most lethal blackmail weapon was neutralized overnight. Sir John Wolfenden lived on to be knighted, enshrined as a pioneer of civil liberty. His son, however, was quietly erased from MI6 archives, a disposable pawn crushed in the 24-month gap between a government knowing what was right and actually making it law. Jeremy didn't die because he lacked the intellect to outsmart the KGB. He died because his own country rigged the board against him long before the game even began.